Hello and welcome to another of InstallFree's training sessions. This is Jonathan again, and this video is the first in the 4 videos of the advanced configuration phase, which is the last step in the advanced setup section. In general, during the advanced configuration, we will optimize and tweak different endpoints related variables in order to make the bridge fit into your infrastructure and make it production ready inside a domain over SMB. This will include configuring the way IFV applications interact and behave when deployed on endpoints, and configure the way in which the bridge virtual client runs and behaves. And by the end of this series of videos, you will, in principle, be able to complete the deployment of the InstallFree Bridge suite, or go on to the advanced connection scenarios sections, which will allow you to enable and configure things like multi-branch access, HTTP access, optimizing terminal server configurations, and more. A few things to note before we start. First and foremost, antivirus programs might prevent virtual applications from running. To overcome this, we recommend setting exclusion rules for these following paths: the appdata/ifbridge and the allusersprofile/ifbridge. And another important reminder, in the advanced configuration setup, we are going to configure the InstallFree Bridge suite for domain endpoints that are connected to the InstallFree file share over SMB. And this is the default setup we usually recommend to start with. Once done with this phase, you can go on and configure advanced connection scenarios, which are covered in later videos. Also, please note that some properties and default values might vary from one bridge suite version to another. In case the change is important, an annotation will appear describing what has changed. In order for that to work, please make sure your YouTube annotations button is on. And one last thing, although this video is comprehensive and includes the most important issues, you might want to consult your setup or user's guide for further and more detailed information. But for now, let's just dive right ahead and start the advanced configuration phase. Now, the first thing we are going to configure is the way virtual applications behave and interact on endpoints, and for that we will use the system preferences, which is the place to configure the environment in a way that is applied to all relevant objects like users, computers, and IFV applications alike. And remember, the configurations made in the system preferences propagate throughout the AD tree. So I'll right-click the AD tree, select System Preferences. Now, as you can remember, the system preferences were already mentioned in previous sections as a means to configure the system defaults. Later, these configurations can be changed at individual levels of the AD tree, and any changes made will be inherited by children objects, and it's useful now to remind you again of the precedence each level takes on others. And you can pause the clip now to study the diagram in detail. Okay, so since we don't need to change the bridge or engine versions, we'll ignore the resources section and skip to the availability section down here. Now, by default, AOD files, which are the actual packaged virtual applications, and the user data, which contains user-specific customizations, are both configured for offline use, meaning that AOD files are downloaded to the endpoint and user data files are forged locally on the machine. And if I want to change that, I have these 2 drop-down menus here. So let's start with the AOD drop-down. Now, if I'll click it, you can see I have 3 available options: online, offline, and streaming. Configuring the AODs to online will make IFV applications use AODs directly from the InstallFree master file share. This option will not require hard disk space on the endpoints, but on the other hand, in terms of speed, it will not perform as well as offline mode. And remember, this means that your users must have continuous connection to the file share, so they won't get their IFV applications when offline. The other option is offline, which means that AODs will be downloaded in their entirety to the endpoint and enable users to enjoy offline availability as well as reduce network traffic. And lastly, the streaming option will stream the AOD files at block level according to the modules called for by the IFV applications and cache the downloaded segments of AODs locally. But again, just like the online option, this will require users to be connected to the file share at all times. And although cached locally, the AODs configured to stream will not fire up unless connected to the file share. So I will select offline as InstallFree recommends for most scenarios, which will improve and allow offline availability and superior performance. Now let's move to the next dropdown, the user data here. And again, the user data enables you to configure the availability, in this case either online or offline. The online user data will keep a single copy of the user data on the InstallFree file share or another location you have set for user data like the user's network drives. This will make sure that when users move between endpoints, they will always get the same consistent customizations they have made. But again, this will require users to be connected at all times and will not work on HTTP connections. So again, it's very important to emphasize, you should choose online only if you don't need to allow offline users to use virtual applications. Now, the offline user data, however, will keep only one copy of the user's user data on each host from which the user logs in. So it is mostly suitable for users that use one main endpoint, because if they move to another endpoint, their old user data won't be available, nor will any new changes sync with their original user data file. So I'll select offline again according to InstallFree's recommendations, so users will be able to work offline. Okay, now under the user data dropdown, you can see the delete user data after each session checkbox. Enabling this will make IFV applications revert to their original state by deleting their user data each time the application shuts down, effectively eliminating any user customizations. This option is typically used by organizations in which users use shared endpoints that require the same user experience at all times. This is why in most cases we recommend leaving this checkbox unchecked, especially in the system defaults we are now configuring. If, however, I was to click it, you can see I get this red X. This, of course, disables the option. If I want to enable it, I need to click it again to get the regular V sign. But since I want it off, I'll click again to disable the checkbox, and let's go on to the separate temporary files from user data checkbox. Now, enabling this option will make sure that the temp files designated by the application itself to be dumped in the temp folder will be stored outside of the main user data, so the user data itself won't get inflated with junk temporary files. This is why we usually recommend enabling this option, and again I will have to click it twice to enable it. Now notice that checking the separate temporary files from user data checkbox unlocks the checkbox below it, the delete temporary user data after each session. This option enables you to make sure that the temp files are deleted after each session. And in order to save disk space, we also recommend enabling it. Again, using 2 clicks to get the V sign. Okay, so the AOD and user data are configured to offline, and the temporary files related checkbox are on. And basically, we're finished with this specific tab, but before I go on, I want to show you the advanced options accessible from the edit button down here. So I'll click it. And as you can see, you can control a variety of options. For instance, you can control the process name, which will show up on the endpoint when an application is running, which usually consists of the real service name with an additional parenthetical V, as you can see here. You can also control, for instance, whether applications will use Windows Aero, and even enable 16-bit applications. And to learn more on each option, you can consult your setup or user's guide, or simply read the description pane down here per variable. Okay, now let's move on to the next tab, the bridge policies. So I'll click it. And again, I'll skip the top general section since there's nothing to change there just yet, and go down to the usage limitation section, and here you can control, for instance, the date from which applications will not be available anymore. So I'll click the End By Radio button, and pushing this button here will give me a calendar from which I can select the date desired. And again, remember, you can do this for any object in the AD tree. So if, for instance, you have an OU or group dedicated for temporary employees or on-site contractors, you can limit the time they will have access to your virtual applications. The next option down here will limit the time IFV applications can work if the endpoint did not connect to the file share. So if, for instance, a user didn't connect to the install-free file share in the last 60 days, the bridge will disable access to IFV applications. And the last tab, which I'll review quickly, is the ADM tab here. And the ADM tab lets you add regular ADM files that will be enforced on IFV applications. And in this case, if I'll add it to the system preferences, it will take effect on all users and computers, and thus on all applications. So all you need to do is simply click this Add button, and you can employ any existing ADM. And for more information, please review your users or setup guide. And one last thing is the interconnectivity ADM, which is a sort of internal ADM file that controls how IFV applications interact with each other and with their environment. Basically, down here you have the slider, which allows you to configure interconnectivity based on defaults set by install-free. The low interconnectivity is mostly used for very high security facilities, but might severely affect user experience as applications will be completely opaque to one another and the host. The high interconnectivity, on the other hand, might in some cases lead to some security vulnerabilities, but will in effect create the most dynamic of all environments. Although the medium interconnectivity, which we recommend using, is a great balance between the two. On the other hand, you can push this custom level button here, which will allow you to configure each variable or reset back to one of the default states. And again, you can consult our guides or the description pane for each given variable. But for now, I'll select the default medium level as recommended and click OK to make all the changes I've done to take effect. Okay, so this basically concludes the IFV application configurations part of the advanced configuration. And in the next videos, we will configure the bridge preferences. Thank you all for watching.